The midday sun blazed high in the cloudless sky, its relentless heat baking the dusty ground below. Nadia Malik stumbled forward, her hands bound tightly in front of her, wrists raw from the rough rope that dug into her skin with every step. The clinking of her captors' weapons and the crunch of their boots on the gravelly path were the only sounds that filled the oppressive silence. Nadia kept her gaze fixed ahead, her dark eyes burning with defiance, though every fiber of her being wanted to scream or collapse from exhaustion. She refused to give them the satisfaction. Nadia wasn't a soldier, nor was she some reckless adventurer. At just 25 years old, she was a teacher, a woman who had spent her days in a tiny classroom on the outskirts of Kabul, teaching young girls the power of words and knowledge. Her work was simple yet revolutionary, in a region where even the concept of educating girls was seen as an act of rebellion. She knew the risks, but she believed in her mission, in her students, and in the idea that one day things could be different. Her captors clearly didn't share her optimism. Days earlier, they had stormed her classroom, dragging her out in front of her students. The memory of their screams haunted her as she trudged into a compound hidden deep in the mountains. The air here was heavy, the shadows long, and the walls around her bore the weight of violence and despair. Nadia's heart pounded as they shoved her into a windowless room with cracked concrete walls and a rusted lantern hanging from the ceiling. The door slammed shut, the echo vibrating through her chest. She looked around, forcing herself to breathe slowly. The small, bare room offered nothing but emptiness, no comfort, no hope, and seemingly no way out. But Nadia wasn't ready to give in. Her mind raced, scanning every detail of her surroundings, every crack in the walls, every sound outside the door. She clenched her fists, the rope biting into her skin. They think they can break me. They think they can silence me. They don't know who they're dealing with. Determination sparked in her chest. Nadia wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the voices they tried to silence, the lives they tried to control. She would not break, not here, not ever. The silence in the dimly lit room was heavy, broken only by the occasional muffled voices of Nadia's captors outside. She sat on the cold, cracked concrete floor, her back against the wall, her hands still bound tightly in front of her. The rough rope chafed her wrists, but she didn't care. Pain was temporary. She had endured worse. What mattered now was survival. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning every detail for anything that could be used to her advantage. The lantern hanging overhead cast weak, flickering light, revealing the uneven surface of the walls. A single barred window high above her head let in a faint sliver of sunlight. The room was small and sparse, but Nadia had learned long ago that even the smallest details could hold the key to freedom. Her thoughts raced. She didn't know how much time she had, or what her captors intended to do. Their words earlier had been vague, laced with threats and accusations. They had called her a traitor, a danger to their way of life, all because she had dared to teach girls to read and write, to give them hope for a future beyond fear and oppression. Nadia shifted slightly, testing the strength of the ropes binding her wrists. They were tight, but not unbreakable. She remembered something her father had taught her when she was younger, how to use leverage and friction to loosen knots. Carefully, she rubbed the ropes against the sharp edge of a cracked tile on the floor, keeping her movements slow and deliberate to avoid making noise. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Finally, she felt the tension in the rope begin to give. Her heart raced as she worked faster, her breathing shallow. Just as the last strand of the rope frayed and broke, she froze. Footsteps approached the door, heavy and deliberate. The handle rattled, and the door creaked open. Nadia quickly tucked her hands behind her back, feigning submission. A tall, bearded man entered, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He glared at her, his expression a mix of disdain and authority. "Time to move," he said gruffly, gesturing for her to stand. Nadia obeyed, keeping her movements slow and steady. As she stood, she noted the position of his rifle, the way his grip on it was loose, almost careless. He wasn't expecting resistance. He grabbed her arm roughly and led her out of the room. The compound was larger than she had expected, a network of interconnected buildings surrounded by high walls. Armed men stood at various points, their eyes scanning the horizon. Nadia kept her head down, pretending to be compliant, but she was cataloging every detail. the number of guards, the layout of the compound, the location of potential exits. They brought her to a larger room where a group of men sat around a table, maps and papers spread out before them. The man who had dragged her here pushed her forward, forcing her to stand in the center of the room. All eyes turned to her. One of the men, older and clearly in charge, leaned back in his chair and studied her. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with menace. Nadia met his gaze, refusing to cower. "Because you're afraid of what I represent." The room fell silent. The older man's expression darkened, and he stood, towering over her. "You're here because you refuse to learn your place, teaching girls, filling their heads with ideas that will only lead to rebellion? You've brought this on yourself." Nadia's heart pounded, but she refused to show fear. "And what do you think will happen if you silence me?" she asked, her voice steady. "Do you think the girls will stop wanting to learn? Do you think their hope will die with me? You're fighting a losing battle." The older man's hand lashed out, striking her across the face. Nadia staggered, but didn't fall. The pain burned, but it only strengthened her resolve. She straightened, meeting his gaze again. "You can kill me," she said, her voice unwavering, "but you can't kill the truth." The room was silent for a long moment. Then, the older man gestured to the guards. "Take her back. We'll decide what to do with her later." As the guards led her out, Nadia's mind raced. She had made her point, but she knew she couldn't wait for them to decide her fate. She needed to act now. Back in her cell, Nadia wasted no time. With her hands free, she began to examine the barred window. The rusted metal looked sturdy, but the mortar around it was cracked and crumbling. She used a piece of broken tile from the floor to scrape at the edges, working methodically to loosen the frame. Hours passed, and her fingers bled from the effort, but she didn't stop. She thought of the girls she had taught, the ones who had begged her to return even when threats loomed. She thought of her family, who had supported her despite the risks. She thought of the life she wanted to reclaim. Finally, the frame shifted slightly and Nadia felt a surge of hope. She pushed harder, using all her strength to pry the bars loose. The sound was faint but distinct, and she paused, listening for any sign of the guards. When none came, she continued. By the time the bars gave way, the sky outside had darkened, the faint glow of moonlight illuminating her escape route. Nadia climbed through the narrow opening, her heart pounding as she dropped silently to the ground outside. The compound was quiet, the guards relaxed in their routines. Nadia moved carefully, sticking to the shadows as she made her way toward the perimeter wall. She spotted a pile of crates stacked near the corner and used them to climb up, her muscles straining as she hauled herself over the edge. When her feet hit the ground on the other side, she didn't stop. She ran, her bare feet pounding against the rocky ground, the cool night air biting at her skin. Behind her, the compound remained still, unaware of her absence. Nadia didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stop. Every step was a step toward freedom, toward hope, toward the life they had tried to take from her. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in days, she felt the weight begin to lift. She wasn't just surviving, she was escaping, and she would make sure the world knew what she had endured, what they had done, and what she had fought for. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of orange and pink as Nadia stumbled into a small, quiet village nestled in the valley. Her body ached, her feet were raw and blistered, but she pressed on. The villagers, startled by her disheveled appearance, quickly surrounded her with questions. A kind-faced woman approached, draping a shawl over Nadia's shoulders and leading her to sit on a shaded stoop. Nadia didn't waste time explaining. In hurried, broken sentences, she recounted her captivity, the threats, and her desperate escape. The villagers listened in shocked silence, their expressions shifting from fear to resolve. Among them was a man with a cell phone who immediately called the authorities. Hours later, a convoy of local police and international aid workers arrived. Nadia felt a flood of relief as she saw their uniforms, their determined faces. The authorities took her statement, carefully documenting every detail of her ordeal. They assured her that her captors would be hunted down, that justice would be served. For the first time in days, Nadia felt safe. But her fight wasn't over. As she sat in the back of an aid truck, wrapped in a blanket and sipping hot tea, her thoughts turned to the girls she had left behind. Her captors might be taken down, But the ideology they upheld, the oppression they thrived on, was still out there. Nadia knew her work was far from finished. A week later, bruised but unbroken, Nadia stood before a gathering of journalists and activists in Kabul. Her story had spread, igniting outrage and sparking conversations about the oppression faced by women and girls in the region. Nadia spoke with quiet strength, her voice unwavering as she shared her experience and called for action. "They tried to silence me," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room, "but they only made my voice louder." Nadia's escape was just the beginning. She had survived the unthinkable, but now she was determined to turn her ordeal into a weapon for change. Her resilience became a rallying cry, a symbol of defiance in the face of oppression.